we all seem to trust what's going on in the dream, even though we recognize that it's weird. Surrender yourself to the tale and listen to what I might be trying to tell you. There's a lot of these stories around, aren't there?
A lot of franchises. Almost like no one can make anything original anymore.
People were expecting of Narnia what C.S. Lewis was not trying to give them. Hello, Reformed Mythologist Nate Locke here with another episode of Behold the Comments. I'm joined as ever by Eleanor of Lothlorien. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
We're going to dive right in with some comments from a video from the Speak Life channel. This is quite an old video. It was a video I did on a series called The Franchise Storytelling, and it concerns Narnia, those chronicles. I made a video called Narnia is a Terrible Franchise, and just a couple of days ago at Sir Riffsalot 4158 said, all this aside, what always bugged me about this series was always just that it never made any sense at all. I know it's magic and all that, but there's only so many times you can be asked to suspend your disbelief before it becomes insulting. And then he goes on to talk about the way that the children are just thrown into this world with a white witch and a magical lion, and how there's a prophecy about them getting the 4 thrones of Cair Paravel, and basically ended up by saying, I'm sorry, I really enjoyed the out loud reading of the first book we had in school when I was a kid, but even then I remember feeling awkwardly about all of this. Anyway, that's just one fellow's opinion. Peace out. Well, glad you ended on that note, because otherwise we might have had to get into fisticuffs. Narnia is a terrible franchise, but Narnia is a wonderful series of books, which I believe he's missed the point of. And it reminded me of the discussion that was taking place kind of November time last year, 2024, when news had come out about Greta Gerwig's new Narnia film for Netflix. And people were saying, oh yeah, there's loads of plot holes and it doesn't make any sense. And then there was a great online debate about whether people were expecting of Narnia what C.S. Lewis was not trying to give them. And so this idea of fully comprehensive world building, as opposed to myth making. Any thoughts on this?
I really liked your points in the video, especially about the way it moves through time and you don't have the same protagonists throughout the series of books. So yeah, it doesn't naturally lend itself to a movie franchise. However, I will say that as a child, I very much enjoyed the BBC television series. Yes,
and maybe that was because the BBC television series from the 1980s was... no one was expecting that to have the kind of world-building rigor that I think we now seem to demand of anything which has got any kind of multiple stories within the same world. Yeah, so the debates online just seem to be a kind of insistence that the mechanics of any given world ought to be obvious and apparent, and that you could explore that in more depth by yourself, as opposed to you're taken through the story that the author is trying to tell you. And some people kind of pontificated that maybe this is because of immersive kind of open world video games, that people now seem to want to jump into Hyrule or Fortnite, and they want to be able to test every possible function, and the boundaries of that world are not important to them. And I don't think it's necessary, because I don't think that's the point of the story. And I think when people are trying to find things like plot holes, it's usually because they're trying to go off the track that the storyteller is trying to keep them on, because they want to determine the course of the story, they want to determine the outcome, rather than saying, surrender yourself to the tale and listen to what I might be trying to tell you. Partly it's just a function of the internet provides us with this kind of obsessive compulsive fandom, which means you can find other people who are like interested in this stuff, and then you can keep digging down far enough, and the only thing I suppose that's going to provide you with a sufficient substance to cope with all your questions is a fully realized mechanical magic system world with endless opportunities for fan fiction, whereas that's not what Lewis is trying to do. He's trying to tell a fairy story, and you kind of have to go with him on that. If people want to dive into any more of this kind of stuff, I discovered a beautiful little article by a man named John Ehrett on a website called mereorthodoxy.com, and it's called You Don't Escape to Narnia. I thought it was a fantastic piece of writing, just wrestling with some of the issues that Reformed Mythologist fans might be into. So check that out. Also connected organically to the discussion about Narnia is a comment which came from Behold the Comments, episode 5, came from Aliyah Larson 9881, who was talking about an article about Alan Moore. So Alan Moore, the author and comic book writer, V for Vendetta, Watchmen, other stuff like that. He's got a new book called The Great When, and he was interviewed by the Irish Times. He's talking about the issue of people crossing the threshold and going from one reality into another reality, which is obviously a massive thing within storytelling, and we pick up on it all the time. Anyway, apparently when asked about the threshold reality bending thing that happens with his, he said, I wanted the sections set in The Great When to feel as disorienting as it would do if you were suddenly in another world. One of the things I'm really tired of in current fantasy is how the kids go through the back of the wardrobe in Narnia and it's not really a big deal. People go into these worlds as if it was visiting Milton Keynes. No! You'd be booking yourself into psychiatric care. You'd have a complete mental breakdown. Now, that's funny. You want Alan Moore to say stuff like that. I wonder whether he's just picking on Narnia because going through the back of the wardrobe into Narnia is such a classic example of crossing the threshold into an unknown world. What do you think to his point of you ought to be just going absolutely nuts and vomiting everywhere and freaking out as soon as you step into Lantern Waste?
The humour works, but I think taking it from more of a psychology point of view, humans are extremely adaptable and extremely good at surviving and taking things in their stride.
Yeah.
Depending on someone's personality, you might end up with someone who may just curl up into a ball and have a huge existential crisis. But usually our stories are about people who are heroes and who do take things in their stride.
Yeah. I think that's fair. And also, if they're children, they might just be more trusting. And also, within Narnia, there's a range of different reactions when people first step into Narnia, right? So when Eustace first gets onto the Dawn Treader, he's like super angry about the whole thing and freaking out about everything. Alan Moore goes on, anytime any of my characters enter the Great When, they're vomiting, weeping, fainting, because that's what I figure ordinary people would do if something even slightly fantastic happened. I don't know that that's how people do tend to react to strange situations all the time. And if the dream element is in any way instructive as to what us entering into other realms might be like, then we all seem to trust what's going on in the dream, even though we recognize that it's weird. But anyway, that is all really just off the back of Aliyah's comment from the last Behold the Comments video. Here was a comment by Womakliff. He watched the wrestling video and said, I 100% recommend Super Eye Patch Wolf's video essays on wrestling. It was my introduction to the medium's power for storytelling, the basic ideas like faces, heels, and kayfabe. For me, the most fascinating aspect of wrestling storytelling that he highlights in his Undertaker essay is how the passage of time in the world of the story is identical to that of the real world. A book, film, or song can advance 1,000 years in the span of a second, but wrestling operates on the same chronological time plane as we do, which presents a unique medium to explore the themes of inevitable decline and mortality. What a brilliant point.
So interesting.
Very, very good, yes. How is time concertinaed and how is time stretched out?
So, you started watching Vinland Saga.
I did start watching Vinland Saga and I enjoyed it, as I said, in the Vinland Saga video. And Turbo Z, or Turbozed, said, you're the first creator on YT, YouTube, to mention both Vinland Saga and The Rest is History podcast, two of my favourite shows in two different media. I think you'll find that Yukimura did a good job of researching the history of that period, but her history isn't really the focus, it's just a very interesting backdrop for the moral and ethical themes the author explores through his characters. I'm not Christian, but from a non-Christian perspective, I don't think I've ever seen anime, or any other show for that matter, convey very Christian themes in such a compelling way. It's able to convey some very weighty messages in a non-preachy and deft way. Really great stuff. That's exactly what I thought.
You've watched a bit more of it since the
I
video,
have, so I
haven't
finished
you?
the first season, And there are loads of episodes where I thought I've not seen genuine Christian faith portrayed in popular media so sincerely. Just what if there were characters who actually believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and in the face of religious kind of violence and persecution were prepared to hold to that? There was a particular episode which kind of stands out by itself. Season 1, episode 14. We should probably do a video on that episode by itself because it's incredibly powerful.
I've only watched the first 4 episodes, which is what you did the original video on, but I am keen to watch more.
We had another comment from @JakeFerrand6124, who said, though I doubt Christianity will be espoused by the main character, the Japanese opinion on Christianity is typically quite high, despite the history of Japan and history. Presumably Christianity. From what I have seen of the show, there is a reference toward Christianity, but never necessarily an outright evangelizing. And then, jumping down, I think it's a fantastic show, and I do really enjoy it as a Christian. And then he talked about 2 types of anime, which I'd never heard of. Seinen or something.
Seinen.
And then shonen. So the first one is more focused on mature themes such as growth and retrospect, whereas shonen is more focused on entertainment, mostly of teenagers. So yeah, I thought that's helpful to have kind of buckets to put different types of anime into.
Yeah, I've always wanted to get more into anime.
Yeah, it's just felt so impenetrable, the whole kind of anime world. And that's why I've really enjoyed Vinland Saga, because I'm like, okay, I can stay in this. I'm happy
This
here.
is the way in.
Let's take a look at Christopher Nolan Odyssey reveal reaction video comments. At Maddie Bandowski 1012 said, certain epic myths do very well in adaptation. For example, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a comedic retelling of the Odyssey set in the 1930s American Deep South. Or Moulin Rouge, which is an adaptation of the story of Orpheus set in 1900s France. They are amazing films that try to be grounded in a sense, and yet these characters can't escape a certain sense of fantasy. I think going more interpretive is better sometimes than directly adapting the myth itself. Maybe it's because it's hard to show fantasy well in motion pictures, or that most directors don't seem to embrace the fantasy and try to make it more logical. In any case, I think fantasy and myth are some of the hardest things to adapt directly. What a brilliant comment.
Yeah.
I love that comment. Have you seen either Oh Brother, Where Art Thou or Moulin Rouge?
No, I haven't seen either of those movies.
No.
I
thought you would have seen at least one.
I've always meant to watch Moulin Rouge, but have never got round to it.
They're both very strong.
I don't think I've even heard of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
The Coen brothers. It's got George Clooney going round as a escaped criminal.
Oh, my bad. What do you think of the idea of maybe a Christopher Nolan Odyssey, but set in the modern world or something
I don't
similar?
think he's going to. From everything we've seen, he's sticking with the, epic mythic fantasy. It's weird because he's got to go back to the underworld. I think that's the thing that feels really challenging. Passion of the Christ 2? Reaction? Gotti Brewer, friend of the show, said, I leave this comment in the hope that it will prompt another beyond the comments because Eleanor is a delight.
Thank you, Scott.
Ah, so there you go.
This is for you.
This is entirely for you. We were going to do something completely different. At The Real Lazray, I'm a little uncertain about this movie. Any attempt to try and tell a story about what happened to Jesus between his death and resurrection immediately enters the realm of apocrypha. The harrowing of hell is more of a, forgive the phrase, throwaway reference in the Bible. A story about this would only have a handful of disjointed verses to pull from. Any details about Jesus during that time, beyond he went there, preached, and came back to life, would not be biblical and therefore could not be trusted to be an accurate representation of the truth. This is the idea that Mel Gibson's next film, The Passion of the Christ 2, will focus on what happens to Christ after his death and before his resurrection, or in his resurrection, or the spiritual realities of the first 3 days of Easter. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it is interesting because we get verses saying we shouldn't add or take away anything from the Bible. So in a sense, if you take artistic license with the Bible, you're in a bit of trouble.
Yeah.
As The Real Lazare says, there's not a whole lot in the Bible to go on for the harrowing of hell. So you can't really do that without taking some creative liberties.
I mean, there's a couple of verses. 1 Peter 3, verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, verse 19, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built. In it only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through the water. There's some interpretive questions about what to do with those verses. Is it the spirit of Jesus before he rejoins his physical body and is physically resurrected? So in the spirit, is he going down during the Easter Saturday to harrow hell, to preach to those who are in hell? Or the same spirit that raises Jesus from the dead is the same spirit who preached to people in the days of Noah?
Is there a Nolan time travel element in there?
That would be interesting, weaving back and forward. The real question is, what would Nolan do with wrestling? How would Nolan cope with the time signature of wrestling, which matches the time signature of the viewer? Anyway, fascinating stuff. Thank you at The Real Lazare, because these are important questions. We know that the scriptures are God's revelation to us, so we want to build solidly on that foundation. So it's a good question to ask if something getting too speculative. The alternative point to put alongside that would be to say that the Bible doesn't have to give you specific references and verses which prove your point by themselves, because actually you need to take a biblical theology. You take the scriptures as a whole, and you can, by proper inference, work things out. So various doctrines of the Christian faith are, of course, developed as a result of reading the whole of the scriptures, rather than there's like a single verse which contains the word Trinity in it or something. So there we go. But great point. The other video we've made this last couple of weeks was The Power of Storytelling with Rachel Allord. Cards on the table, I've also been a bit of a transatlantic voyager.
So it is very much like having two homes.
You feel like you have to represent the entire nation every time you're in a conversation. You have to just go about an ordinary day. Suddenly becomes quite difficult when everything's new and everyone's different from what you're used to.
The best of our stories are the ones that are retelling in a little tiny way the greatest story.
You had a lovely chat with her.
She was lovely. It was charming.
You enjoyed someone who could relate to you. In
Finally, someone understood me. Yeah, some of that cross-cultural stuff. I think I just really liked her abilities as a writer. She writes very straightforwardly and compellingly, and it was a good length. It wasn't too long. So, Eleanor, what you been watching?
We should have a jingle for that.
We should.
I have been reading The Silmarillion.
Oh, Tolkien nerd.
My dad bought me a beautiful set of Tolkien books for Christmas. So I've started reading The Silmarillion, and I'm reading it slowly because I want to understand who all the characters are.
It sounds as though that's a good way to read it. Mm-hmm. Does it work just to sit down and go, I'm just going to read it all the way through?
So the copy of The Silmarillion that I got came with this little book that talked about the history of the Silmarillion and how it was pulled together and how Tolkien basically wrote it over his almost his entire lifetime.
Yeah.
And when Christopher Tolkien started putting it all together, firstly he was like, okay, I'm going to put in all the different versions that my father had written of all these stories, because there doesn't seem to be one complete through line. And he started trying to do that project and then just found it was way too big. He had to actually pick something that was the mythology. And so he went about doing that, and that's what the Silmarillion is. So I think the Silmarillion can be a little bit bitty. It's definitely not a franchise epic like The Lord of the Rings is, where you can just follow the characters through the story, because you're getting like 4,000 years of history in the Silmarillion.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah. So yeah, it's different to The Lord of the Rings. But I think Tolkien's world building and writing is just so wonderful that I'm going to enjoy it anyway for what the Silmarillion is. Yeah. Just part one, talking about the creation. It was beautiful. It was talking about a creation brought into being through music, which is a beautiful concept.
Well, Lewis had Aslan singing Narnia into being and The Magician's Nephew, so that was nice.
How about you, Nate? What you been watching?
The thing that's had the biggest emotional impact on me in the last few days wasn't something I was watching, it was something I was listening to. And it totally blindsided me. Do you remember back in about 2015, it might have been 2014, there was an Australian singer with an incredible voice called Sia, and she had a song called Chandelier. Driving in the car, driving home from the shop with my daughter, and we've got a playlist that's just randomly popping up with songs. And that song came on, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember this one. I wanna see And then I started really thinking about the words in a way that I don't think I'd processed previously. And it's a story about basically someone who doesn't want to live. And so they just drink themselves into oblivion. I'm going to live like tomorrow doesn't exist. And it literally just made me cry in the car. I was like sitting there just going, this song is so sad. Sometimes a piece of music or a TV show or something, you're not expecting it and it just bam. That was the last thing that made me cry.
Are you aware that Sia has been cancelled?
I'm not.
You're not aware
I'm not
at all?
aware that Sia's been... I knew that I hadn't heard any recent songs by Sia, but why did she get cancelled?
She made a film with Maddie in it. Do you know who Maddie is?
Was this the girl who danced in the video of Chandelier?
Yes.
Okay,
and
young ballet dancer.
She was in Dance Mums, which is another controversial reality TV show.
Everything's so problematic.
You don't know any of this.
I thought we're beyond all this now.
No.
I mean, I also should say, before you explain this a little bit more, that in the Narnia video, Narnia is a terrible franchise, I make a point of referencing Neil Gaiman. Now, I do know that recently he's obviously been exposed, or certainly accused of, some pretty horrific abuses of trust and people. And so, yeah, we should just flag that up as well. To go back to your point on Sia.
So Sia created a film called Music with Maddie as the star, and it was a film about autism.
Okay.
And it just didn't seem like a lot of research went into it regarding autism, and it actually showed some very unsafe practices in terms of looking after autistic children. As soon as that film came out, everyone cancelled Sia.
Well, now I want to cry even more because, as I say, the only thing I was really thinking about was the persona and the song. I mean, think of other songs that fit that kind of bill. Just Dance by Lady Gaga, which again, vintage, and that idea that there might be people whose lives are so miserable that if you just get intoxicated and try and forget about it, but then when you put that into a song and people are then dancing to that song whilst there, it just
isn't there a Kesha song as well that's like We Want to Die Young?
Well, there we go. Lady Gaga, Kesha and Sia, welcome to 2014, everybody. We're here. And last thing I saw at the cinema was Sonic the Hedgehog 3, a perfectly serviceable third film. And yet it's difficult to imagine that entire franchise working without Jim Carrey.
I remember the first one, all the controversy about the animation stuff.
Yeah.
I don't understand how we're now at number 3. When did that happen? I don't even remember number 2 coming out. I thought number 1 was going to be a flop.
No, it's just been ticking along. Yeah.
In the background without me knowing.
There's a lot of these stories around, aren't there? Yeah.
A lot of franchises. Almost like no one can make anything original anymore.
Potentially, but I think what we ought to do is to leave people with a message that encourages them that in the face of overwhelming media onslaught, they don't need to feel that they're drowning.
It's almost like you need an NPC phrase to say at the end of a video.
Let's try something. Please do remember that media consumption is optional. You are under no obligation to watch any of these films, TV shows, videos, listen to the songs, play the video games. I'm Reformed Mythologist Nate Morganlock. I'm glad you were here.